Good afternoon or morning or night or wherever you are in the world today. Thank you for entering our very first episode of the Changing Hearts and Minds series. For those of you that have not heard yet or just watching this, the Changing Hearts and Minds series is really all about inquiring, understanding, and then looking into potential possibilities and new ways to move into the marketplace by looking at research, looking at the sentiments and mindsets that people have, and then figuring out how to embrace those new experiences. This episode is dedicated to research, and we are going to go a little bit deeper into the topic soon. I am Ellza Malok. I run the company called Blue Monarch Group, which is a human behavior consulting firm.
And that's me. Is that for me? Hi, Ellza, and I'm Tracey Lande. I am a partner at Catalyst & Co. We're a strategic enablement firm. We help founder CEOs overcome the frictions that slow strategic execution and impede growth.
Thank you, Tracey. So the first episode that we're launching is really all around the go-to-market executive dilemma, focusing on too much short-term goals and not enough long-term plays. We're going to really dig deep into organizations that are probably in that lower to middle market range because we want to be focused on this topic, and the typical issues, roadblocks, challenges that occur if you're a go-to-market executive, especially in that first 12 to 18-month period. So Tracey, why don't you and I set the stage for what we see in the marketplace? I have a couple of statistics that I know we have off of it where the average go-to-market executive spends about 14 to 17 months in a role before they are parting from that particular organization. And we also know that there's a lot of reasons as to why that occurs and what is this constant and perpetual pattern of go-to-market executives coming in, having a very short runway, and then another one comes in, and then another one comes in. It's just like that perpetuous cycle that continues to happen. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about what are some of the common themes of why that occurs.
Yeah. I think one of the ones that we hear about the most is sort of this impedance mismatch between what's happening in the C-suite and what's happening down in the business unit. There's sort of a disconnect that happens with the corporate strategy, and then whether it makes it or not, or how cohesive and coherent it is when it comes down to the business unit strategy. So when the CMO, for example, marketing is a really easy one to pick on. When our CMO is planning tactics and implementation, there seems to be this requirement or need to come back up into to the CEO to get buy-in, where in a fully planned strategic management, where all the phases are considered, that probably would have been done on the front end, and you'd have a more fluid experience once we get down into implementation, and you wouldn't see those breakdowns as much.
Okay, I can see that. So the misalignment between here's the strategic vision, here are all the parties that are going to support that strategic vision, making sure that's communicated, and then the second tier to distill even further. So that way directors or even mid-level managers can say, oh, I see how this all integrates with each other. Is that an accurate?
That's right.
Yeah.
And a really easy way to kind of bring that down into, like, what does that look like? Ask yourself, does my business unit have a cohesive and clear strategy? You might hear that there's many strategies, but is there a documented single source of truth business unit strategy for your unit outside of marketing? I'd say that marketing usually is probably kind of at the forefront. Typically, there isn't, and that's why as a result, while you see functional managers, when you ask, is there a strategy, they might say, we don't have one. It's maybe not documented, it's out there, but they haven't really gotten aligned around it.
Yeah. And I also think a part of that is also due to some of the strategy ideation phase that occurs. There's this notion of, okay, here's some plays that we have to develop the strategy, but are they informed, or are they just perceived or assumptive plays to say, I think if we're going to go to market for this technology tool and we're going to sell to legal, then here's the sentiments or preconceived notions I have. I think that stage of staying in perceived or assumptive, rather than getting some really tight knit information around it and then moving into like a more validated state of those assumptions, is also really critical. Because if I think about, okay, I have this strategy, and I know you have a very detailed process of kind of creating and shaping a strategy throughout the entire life cycle of a strategy. Um, there's this constant notion, and we know that 63% of CEOs catch themselves, not just notice, but catch themselves going to find information that already validates their point of thinking. So even
Yes.
if you're going into finding information, you're only looking for the things that back your thought process. It's a very interesting human condition that we all face, and it's a human one. It's not necessarily a, an arrogance play. It's actually just completely normal for you to do that. You have to build in
Hmm.
practices to go through it. But can you talk a little bit more about your stages of moving from perceived to informed and then to validated? What do those activities look like for an organization to say, okay, we want to form a strategy, but we should start with what we know, what we really know, instead of what we assume?
Yeah. So I think that you probably could speak to the bias that you just spoke to, and there's probably six other ones that are at play when we're kind of upstream in the planning and strategy shaping phases. So I'd say the most important one to get out of our own navel gazing is to have diversity of thought. So typically in strategy, you'll see the CEO, COO, sometimes CFO, but to be able to bring the rest of your executive team into that process in order to have that diversity of thought and kind of divide and conquer. But yes, all of us as human beings, myself included, have these sort of bias confirmations, I think, where we set out to validate what we want to be true, but that is in a perception stage. And in so the phases that I look at are planning, strategy, tactics, implementation. It's really basic, but what I love about it is that it doesn't matter what strategy my client partners are using, it can roll up into that. And we don't care what strategy. So first of all, if you ask anybody what strategy is, you will get an answer, and I guarantee they will all be different. We care less about that and more about just making sure that we are validating, getting out of perceived and into informed when we're doing our internal analysis and our environmental, our external analysis. And so validating, bringing in that data on the front end moves us from perceived into an informed state.
Yeah. And I know that confirmation bias, even like positive recall, are all things that influence people on what plays they want to actually go into. But your planning stage is all that assessment. And I know you and I met through
That's right.
Influential You, which has the planning, strategy, tactics, implementation, the PSTI model baked
Mm-hmm.
in. Um, but that entire planning phase is a lot of inquiry to say what is out there in the market. And I think you're right in the sense of, if you don't have the right people to think about what's out there, especially when it comes to like revenue roles,
Mm-hmm.
because I can see myself sitting and saying, okay, we're a $25 million company in tech that sells to legal. Let's continue that story.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
we may not have a CMO because we're too small. So how do I solve for that? If I don't have a CMO, do I bring in the directors of marketing because they're the next layer that I have to bring on?
We talk about that a lot, and I always I want to shift my thinking because you're absolutely right. We talk about leadership, the C-suite, but really this idea, and that's actually kind of legacy thinking if you think about it. The ecosystem, the landscape, what is needed for today in this ambiguous, complex, tumultuous landscape is the ability to be agile. And that requires something called situational leadership or situational leaders. So it's really whomever in your ecosystem, in your company, that is going to be responsible for that move or that play. So, for example, it is kind of crazy that we don't have a go-to-market lead at that table, whether it's the salesperson or head of sales or head of marketing, whomever is going to take that play. And if you don't have someone to take that play, that's a whole nother strategic question that needs to be answered, because you must have the right people, as we've learned in this advanced business study that we've been in for the last 2 years, in order to accelerate. And that's what we're looking for, not only in having informed and validated strategy, but in order to have the right people in the right parts of the transaction. We often ask, where are we in the transaction and who's leading? And you need to know that at all times so that we can accelerate. And that's what delivers through this competitive differentiator or advantage, if you will, advantage for companies so that they can accelerate their strategies forward.
Yeah, it increases the chances of success, because you also have to think about, and I'll take it from the human element of, you have the CEO, CFO, COO. Let's say those are the most common roles that show up in that strategy or that planning stage. And then you kind of distill it down and say, hey, this is what we're doing. How are you getting buy-in with the rest of the organization to say this is what we're doing? It's a very normal reaction for those that report to you to say, well, how did we get this information? Where did it come from? Like, you have to, and it's so common for you to inquire and ask more information, and the strategy is already baked for you, so there's no wiggle room or opportunity to enhance and develop further, because maybe you didn't bring in those situational leaders like marketing, like sales, like customer success, to say, okay, I like the vision, but I think the tactics are wrong, or the strategic plays that you're playing aren't truly low-hanging fruit, because I'm talking to the customers every day.
Right.
Right? Like, you have this intelligence line that you're not really using to the people that are going to be talking to your customers every single day. And I think we
That's
have
right.
to kind of think about that. But I do also recognize that there are two sides of this pendulum. There's one that runs super, super lean and take on that, more traditional style of leadership of only C-suites are part of the strategy and planning. And then you have ones that are on the opposite end of the spectrum, where they say, yeah, we'll keep C-suites, but we're also only $25 million company, and we have 7 CXOs in our organization, which is a lot. When you get very top heavy, it's also incredibly dangerous, because you may not need the chief partnership officer when there's already a chief revenue officer and a chief marketing officer in the conversation. So there's a risk for you to switch it over. And I think the situational leadership keeps that balance to say, and we also think about it from a cost perspective, how expensive those C-suites are, and what is the return on investment for having that human capital day in, day out from it. And I think that that blend of having the right roles, the situational leadership lends itself really well to. And then it's thinking about, okay, I have all the right people. Am I thinking about this the right way? Am I accurately investigating? Because I do think planning is an investigative workshop of sorts, to kind of throw things at the wall, and then you do the activity of, does it stick? Does it make sense? Does it gel with the rest of everything else?
Right. Answering those strategic questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know your standpoint around that transition from planning to strategy. So planning is like that investigative stage. Strategy is this people and plus plus plays kind of a ecosystem where
Mm-hmm.
it's like, okay, we know what we know and we validated what we know. And now we have people and plays that we have to figure out, and how do we move people across the rest of the cycle. What
Mm-hmm.
does that exercise look like if I am in strategy and say, okay, we brought in the right people, we're thinking about it accurately.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're in strategy shaping, as you called it. What
Mm-hmm.
does
Mm-hmm.
that activity look like? What is a
You actually
good?
stated it perfectly. I don't really need to add anything else. That was actually really good. But yeah, to your point, we've broken up strategy into two phases. So there's strategy shaping. What are the strategic questions that we need to answer? Leveraging the data that we've gotten out of that first phase, making sure that we have the right people. Again, bringing in the situational leaders. The thing that you're also doing is you're surfacing, what's the word, sort of under leveraged leaders, or that you didn't see the potential in before. So you're already identifying, for when you get to tactics and implementation, who's going to help you accelerate when you get to that point. But you're shaping your strategy. So you're answering the questions. You've got the data to do it so that you can be informed. Informed makes you what? Confident. And then we set strategy. And then there, again, kind of going back to when you think about, wait, 90% of strategy happens at the business unit. Yet, how many business units do you know have a formal strategy? And there lies the disconnect, right? So,
Right.
so if you have the right people at the table, if you will, and you're working on moving that strategy into now strategic initiatives, what are the tactics that we're going to use in order to drive the strategy? And then often that is we didn't even talk about personality types. I think that's a whole nother conversation, but there's a particular person or role that's really well suited for that part. And often they're in the revenue or go to market roles. They find themselves there. And often the people that are moving the tactics into implementation, getting the work done, they're a particular type of personality, and they often find themselves in marketing. So bringing those people in and those roles in at that stage, it's sort of like in sports where you're passing, or the passing of the baton. It's a seamless. There's no hucking strategy over the fence or leaving it to others to figure out what that looks like. And I think that's something that's woefully just missing in today's environment, that particular phase and those particular components.
Yeah. So you have to go through these critical steps, and it's a journey, not necessarily just getting to the destination. The steps are critical for your journey to actually come to fruition. And it sounds also like, um, in situational leadership, even, I could bring a rising star very quickly up the ranks that has a ton of potential that I wouldn't have realized until I brought them into the conversation, because they may have a wealth of information that would either completely empower or totally hinder or kind of blow up the plans I already had. And it's better to do that now than to do that 6 months later when you've already invested an unknown amount of dollars to go down that path. And then you realize, oh, wait, I should have just asked what the customer success team has been saying about what our customers think about the product before we decide to move into another sector that is even more, so on and so forth. So I hear a lot of those stories, and often
Yeah.
like my organization actually gets brought in when there's a critical um point in breakdown that they're just like, we actually can't fix this on our own. We need somebody to come and help us fix this problem,
Yeah.
especially if it's customer facing. It's like you kind of have jumped off the cliff and you've crashed into a set of craters. That's usually when we
Yeah.
come in. And I think your solution helps people turn around a lot sooner so they don't get to that state for it. And these critical steps are important. If I But there's also one other component that you and I have talked about a lot. It's that like accurate thinking, reverse engineering thought process.
Mm-hmm.
And really figuring out what you have and what you can do either with existing resources or with X amount of additional resources. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And I know you do an amazing gap analysis, just to kind of say, here's where you're at and here's where you want to go and here's how you get there. Can you talk a
Yeah.
little bit more about that reverse engineering gap analysis that you work through?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that I'd like to impart is that the work that we do, we don't come in and do the work for you. We can. I've spent more time than I'd like to share in terms of decades in strategic marketing. So I am able to absolutely come down and get in the weeds where needed. But the role that we are playing is by bringing in our framework. We're enabling whatever strategy. Remember, if you ask any leader what strategy is, they'll all have an answer. It'll all be different. We care less about that. We care more about, and there's actually some really popular strategies right now. Good strategy, bad strategy, I think Remelt. But these all roll up into, so we're really kind of meeting them where they are at, and bringing um, bringing them into the work is the work, and we're guiding them on the journey through. So through the work that we're doing is we're building that strategic muscle for them. And a lot of what we're doing are existing methods, gap analysis, what's our current state. My favorite, and I don't want to talk too much about it because it matters less about what we think strategy is, but a lot of what strategy is for me is understanding accurately where we're at. Where are we in all this? And so that's our current state, identifying our desirable outcomes, strategic outcomes, and then going back to look at our available resources, tangible and intangible. If we've done our job properly at the front end in planning, we should be able to quickly see that accurately. And then defining where we have gaps. A lot of what we're trying to do, especially as it relates to strategic initiatives, are not just to go hire somebody. For example, one of your strategic initiatives might be to nearshore your China manufacturing. Well, often in your leadership or even within your organization, you may or may not have an expert to do that. So we'll go find that specialized functional knowledge and embed them for the duration of that project. And really just using the kind of standardized approach to strategic management, planning and implementation, but most importantly, leveraging the team and building up their skills, knowledge, and experience, their strategic muscle, so that by the time we depart, they're off and running autonomously.
Got it. So you're building the behavior that you want for the future. That way, when you're departing, they've actually got all the tools at their disposal and they've got the practice that they need to use and the habits that they need to use moving forward.
And the playbook that they built.
Yeah.
So it's unlike other consultants. We're not leaving them with a deck that will never get opened again.
I like that. And in this aspect, because we're going to go back to the short-term stays, long-term plays environment, is often strategy is thought as either it's like a 3 to 5 year plan or it's a quarterly plan. There's not very much integration or even middle ground throughout it. So if I'm an executive and I'm a go-to-market executive and I'm sitting here and saying, okay, well, I'm measured by quarter, the CEO is actually beholden on adjusting that incentive, because then you're only limiting yourself by your quarterly goals. And you may have annual goals that you cannot complete unless you chip away at it throughout each quarter. But if your goal is, okay, we need X amount of revenue within the quarter, you're not going to focus on anything else because that's where the incentive is. And I could be the most strategic player, but if I know that my entire performance review is based on how I did that quarter, based on this number, I'm not going to focus on anything else.
That's right.
I'm going to make that Q4's problem, not Q1's.
Yes.
And I think that's where it is a go-to-market executive concern, but it's also a CEO and board level concern when you push the wrong incentives to those roles, to say, all right, we have an 18-month plan, and here's the short-term stays, because sometimes you get stuck. And that's why they're called short-term stays, is I end up staying here and I stay in infancy and I never actually become a mature company, because all I'm doing is learning to crawl from one place to the next. I'm not actually learning to walk, and I'm not actually learning to run.
Yes.
Because you're
100%.
reinventing the wheel over and over again. But if I am in this role, what are ways that I could do? What are the things that I could do to open up the possibilities for my leader, for my peers,
Mhm.
my board, as well as potentially the CEO or president that I report to start opening up that conversation? Because I think a lot of executives are stuck in this phase of, I'm kind of stuck through this
Mhm.
perpetual quarterly metric.
I love the way that you said that. You set the table beautifully. There's two things. One is I have an answer coming from my experience of being in these roles, but that's not my role here. My role is to bring up the team that's actually doing the work. And I think the answer is to bring. You talked about executive suite bloat. The one of the band-aids is trying to kind of find the CEO's ear. But what happens is if you have everybody reporting to the CEO, you've got a really bloated senior level team, and the CEO is already overly impacted. So I'm not sure that that's necessarily the answer, but that sentiment that they need to be able to have a through line all the way up past the CEO and into the board, it gets answered in planning and strategy shaping. It gets answered in having all of the right players involved from the beginning until the end. That does not mean that they are all equally making decisions around different components. In fact, there's usually only two personality types that really should be leading any effort for the team as we work through these different phases. But the answer is to give everybody a chance to participate in the process, because it also enables them to build that capability versus bringing it to them after the fact and kind of handing it to them to go implement.
Yeah, so the prescription to this is the right roles, the right
Mm-hmm.
steps, and
Mm-hmm.
accurate thinking through some type of reverse engineering or gap analysis model. So now you have a clear picture, you have the right people at the right time, and you're
Mm-hmm.
following the right practices.
Yes.
Okay.
Sounds
And
simple, right?
yeah, until you put it into practice. But I think if you are a go-to-market executive and you are stuck in that perpetual component, to add to your notes around going to your CEO and saying, hey, if we wanted to meet these 18-month goals, here's some questions that I need to answer. And I would like to bring everybody to the table that I think would be helpful to answer some of these questions. Because yes, I'm going to make the quarter. And if I'm go to market, I may run sales, I may run marketing, I may run CX, I may run a couple of roles or leaders. But again, I'm
Mm-hmm.
relatively small. I'm in that 10 to 50 million. Um, the fastest path to get that conversation going is through a path of inquiry and saying, I see your strategy. I have some questions. I have these aspects that I think would really help me be more successful and potentially my peers. So that way you're opening it from a place of inquiry and increasing the amount of success versus what tends to happen is something gets pushed down and then you just do it for the sake of doing it because that's what you're being asked to. It's not necessarily a rebuttal, it's a seeking to understand activity. And I think if you go in prepared with even one or two colleagues, you can kind of tag team and say, hey, I saw the strategy for sales. How can we help? Here's some questions we have, and vice versa. You're just creating a natural segue for people to collaborate without making it this big thing. Because I do think that there tends to be all right, we've got to have a big strategic offsite or this costly exercise or what have you. And I think some of those things can actually be done relatively quickly, especially in a small organization where there's, only 60, 70 employees and there's 5 or 6 major leaders. You can get into a 2, 3 day or take it in chunks and say, we're all going to work on this together and then take a break for a day or two and then come back. So I think there's a lot of quick
Mm.
solutions to just at least open the door for this path
Yeah.
as
I
opposed to make it a big thing.
Yeah, and I think it often becomes a big thing, right? And I don't know totally why. I think some of it is that strategy. What is strategy? It's so ambiguous, and if you look at like what we learn in business school, everyone learns how to plan strategy to create strategy, but you don't see much curriculum around implementation of strategy. And I think that it's important enough, especially in today's environment, to find maybe a third party neutral champion advocate who can help guide that journey and that conversation to make sure that there's that consequential environment and that rigor and equity, inclusiveness around voice from across the organization. It's that important.
Yeah, I love that strategy advocate is probably an incredibly impactful solution to getting through. And it could be as easy as, hey, we're all just going to chat for 90 minutes on this strategy that we received and figure out if this is the right path, like entering a more informed and validated state, because I think that would be a really good inquiry for that trusted group of people. But I do think that you hit something really important before we close, is strategy is seen as this like big lofty, and planning are these big lofty things. And I think some people think about it as a creative activity. But I actually think and I know some people view it as like purely a analytical activity, and I actually think it's both. I think you need left and right brain to be part of this, because you need intelligence, and you need data and evidence, and you also need people. And you need people aligned, you need people thinking, you need people to like figure out how to solve this puzzle
Diagnosis.
and work together. And I think that's the biggest takeaway, is like strategy and planning are comprehensive, and those two are only half of the cycle. That's the other part. Your quadrants are planning, strategy, tactics, implementation. If you only do those two, you're missing the other 50% to be successful.
That's right. And in current state today, most companies are conflating tactics and implementation. Well, frankly, as well as strategy and tactics. So, and again, that's fine. We don't, however we want to call it, but let's just make sure it all gets done.
Right. Yeah. Less about the semantics, more about the activity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I love this topic. Thank you so much for sitting on this with me. And I think the next couple topics you and I are going to cover in this research edition of Changing Hearts and Minds are the future of work, and how people are behaving in work and what their sentiment is. We're also going to talk a little bit more about this decision-making pattern that C-suites tend to think through, and what biases and what intelligence. I know we covered a little bit here, but we're going to take a deeper dive on the idea of how to make decisions, and what kind of philosophy or frameworks, or both, do you need to make decisions collectively as opposed to just singularly. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to both of us, and until next time.
Thanks, Ellza.
Thanks, Tracey.